4 months later, in April 2003, the remains of Lacey and her unborn son Connor would be discovered along the eastern shoreline of the San Francisco Bay, near where Scott said he had been fishing. On April 13, 2003, the body of a near-term male fetus was found near Point Isabel Regional Shoreline in Richmond, California. The next day, April 14th, Lacey's decomposed torso was discovered approximately a mile away. On December 24, 2002, Scott Peterson had launched a small aluminum fishing boat from the Berkeley Marina, only a few miles from where those remains surfaced. By November 2004, a jury would convict him of first-degree murder for Lacey and second-degree murder for Connor. But long before the recovery of remains, long before the verdict, something else had happened. A line had moved, and the real question is not simply what occurred on the water. It is when permission was granted. On the morning of December 24, 2002, Scott Peterson drove roughly 85 to 90 miles from his home in Modesto, California, to the Berkeley Marina. He had purchased a one-day fishing license on December 23rd. Earlier in December, he had bought a 14-foot aluminum boat, a purchase not widely discussed with family or friends. He told police he had decided to go fishing for sturgeon because it was too cold to golf. He initially mentioned golfing to at least one acquaintance before clarifying to investigators that he had gone fishing. Receipts confirmed he launched his boat that morning. Cell phone records placed him in the Berkeley area. At the same time, back in Modesto, Lacey Peterson, 8 months pregnant, was at home. Neighbors later reported seeing her walking the dog that morning, though timelines became a point of contention at trial. By that evening, Lacey was reported missing. The prosecution would later argue that the fishing trip was not recreational, but calculated. The defense argued there was no direct proof linking the marina to homicide. No eyewitness saw violence, no murder weapon was recovered, no definitive cause of death could be determined due to decomposition. The case would rest on circumstantial architecture, but the psychological shift, the internal permission, likely occurred before the drive to Berkeley. When does an ordinary activity become a staging ground? While search efforts intensified in Modesto, another timeline was happening. In November 2002, Scott Peterson began a relationship with Amber Frey, a massage therapist in Fresno. He told her he was single. On December 9, 2002, more than 2 weeks before Lacey disappeared, Scott told Amber this would be his first Christmas without my wife. That statement was later introduced at trial through recorded calls and testimony. It predates the disappearance. It introduces the idea of cognitive rehearsal. A person begins imagining life without their partner, not in anger, not necessarily in violence, but in possibility. After Lacey was reported missing, Amber saw national news coverage and contacted police. Investigators asked her to record subsequent phone calls. In one recorded conversation on New Year's Eve, Scott told Amber he was in Paris watching fireworks. In reality, he was in Modesto attending a candlelight vigil for Lacey. That dual reality became central to the prosecution's argument. Publicly grieving husband, privately sustaining a romantic relationship. Sustained deception requires internal justification. At trial, prosecutors suggested Scott was motivated by a desire to avoid fatherhood and preserve his lifestyle. Evidence showed financial strain and the affair. The defense argued that the state's theory was speculative and that intense media coverage influenced perception. And it is important to state clearly, there was no direct forensic evidence of a killing inside the home. The medical examiner could not determine exact time or method of death. The case was built through inference, but inference can reveal patterns. The prosecution presented evidence of a homemade concrete anchor found in Scott's warehouse. They argued additional anchors had been made and discarded, though only one was physically recovered. Tidal experts testified that currents in the bay could have carried remains from the Berkeley area to where they were discovered. Justification forms when a person reframes an obstacle as solvable through removal, when exposure threatens identity, when impending responsibility feels suffocating, when an imagined alternative life feels closer than the present one. The act itself, if committed, would have taken minutes. The rationalization likely took longer. The trial was moved from Stanislaus County to San Mateo County due to pretrial publicity. After 6 months of testimony, the jury deliberated for 7 days. On November 12, 2004, Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder of Laci Peterson and second-degree murder of Connor Peterson. In 2005, he was sentenced to death. In August 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned the death sentence because of juror dismissal errors during penalty deliberations. The murder convictions were upheld. In December 2021, he was resentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Attention shifts to Case 2. Brandon Rollins, Kevin Springfield, and Damian Tillman were friends who spent July 17, 2020, doing something ordinary. They went fishing. It was not a holiday or a special occasion. It was simply a Florida summer afternoon, the kind that blends heat, still air, and long stretches of quiet water. They met near Lake Streety Road outside Frostproof in rural Polk County, a place defined more by orange groves and open land than by headlines. The area is sparse and quiet. Dirt paths cut through brush. The lake sits back from the road. On most days, very little happens there. It was a familiar kind of Florida afternoon, humid, still, isolated. The kind of setting where conversations carry across the water and trucks parked along the clearing sit undisturbed for hours. There were no crowds, no nearby houses, no obvious witnesses, just 3 friends spending time together. By nightfall, all 3 men were dead. They were found shot near the water. Nearly 6 years later, the man accused of killing them, Tony T.J. Wiggins, has not yet stood trial for their deaths. Prosecutors have filed notice of intent to seek the death penalty. The trial is currently scheduled for September 2026. This case is about more than what happened at a lake that afternoon. It is about how ordinary conflict can escalate into irreversible violence, and how justice, particularly in a capital case, can stretch across years. Earlier that same day, according to investigators from the Polk County Sheriff's Office, a dispute had surfaced involving a truck engine. Authorities allege that Tony Wiggins believed Kevin Springfield had stolen or sold the engine from his truck. There was no report of violence at that moment. There was no emergency call documenting an immediate fight. There was only an accusation. But accusation can carry weight. In smaller communities, reputations circulate quickly. A claim of theft is not merely about property. It can become about respect, credibility, and standing. Investigators have described the disagreement as the catalyst that preceded the confrontation later that day. That afternoon, Brandon Rollins told his father he was heading out to fish. He joined Springfield and Tillman at the secluded clearing near Lake Streety Road. The location was remote. No surveillance cameras were capturing the area, no storefronts, no gas stations, no houses within immediate view. It was the kind of place chosen for privacy and quiet. By early evening, Rollins stopped answering calls. Concerned, his father drove toward the fishing site. What he found was devastating. All 3 men lying near the water, shot. Autopsies later confirmed that each victim died from gunshot wounds. Investigators also reported that at least one of the men appeared to have suffered physical assault before the fatal shots. The combination of alleged beating and shooting intensified the shock surrounding the case. One detail deeply affected the community. After being shot, Rollins reportedly called his father and said, "Help," before dying. That single word became one of the most haunting elements of early reporting. Within days, authorities arrested Tony Wiggins, his brother William Robert Wiggins, and Mary Whittemore. Prosecutors allege that Tony Wiggins armed himself, drove to the lake after learning the men's location, confronted them, and shot them. The state's theory frames the encounter as deliberate and escalating from the earlier dispute. But those allegations remain to be tested in court. The legal path forward did not move quickly. After his arrest in the triple homicide case, Tony Wiggins faced a separate federal charge, possession of ammunition by a convicted felon. The ammunition referenced in that federal case was connected to the broader investigation surrounding the Polk County killings. Because Wiggins had prior felony convictions, possession of ammunition alone constituted a federal crime. The federal case moved forward first. He was convicted in federal court on the ammunition charge and sentenced in that proceeding. That federal prosecution significantly delayed the state murder trial. The overlapping jurisdiction between federal and state systems, combined with defense scheduling conflicts and the demands of preparing a capital case, extended the timeline. Meanwhile, Polk County prosecutors filed formal notice of intent to seek the death penalty. Capital litigation introduces heightened procedural safeguards. These include expanded discovery, mitigation investigations into a defendant's background, mental health evaluations, extensive pretrial motions, and lengthy jury selection. Each safeguard is designed to protect constitutional rights. Each safeguard also slows proceedings. As of February 2026, the state murder trial is set for September 2026. There has been no conviction, no sentencing in the murder case, no verdict. The case remains pending. The roles of the co-defendants add further dimension to the legal landscape. Mary Whittemore was charged with 3 counts of accessory after the fact and perjury for lying to a grand jury. Investigators stated she purchased the ammunition later used in the murders. Her charges reflect alleged actions after the killings and statements made under oath, rather than direct participation in the shootings themselves. William Robert Wiggins accepted a plea agreement to serve 5 years in prison, followed by 2 years of probation, in exchange for testifying against his brother. However, his sentencing has been deferred. He remains housed in the Polk County Jail rather than state prison because final sentencing will occur after he testifies at trial. If you enjoy watching true crime stories that go deeper into the necessary details, hit the like and subscribe button to help us keep uncovering new cases and sharing the facts that matter. Case 3 comes up next. South Kingstown, Rhode Island. On September 18, 2016, at Ram Point Marina along the quiet shoreline of Narragansett Bay, a 31-foot Sea Ray fishing boat named Chicken Pox eased away from its slip and headed toward the open Atlantic. The marina that morning looked like it always did, boats rocking gently against their lines, early light reflecting off calm water, a handful of people preparing for ordinary coastal outings. Nothing about the departure suggested urgency or distress. It appeared routine, recreational, familiar. On board were 22-year-old Nathan Carman and his 54-year-old mother, Linda Carman. A mother and son heading offshore for a fishing trip, an image that carries a sense of normalcy. There were no public arguments, no visible signs of conflict. The boat moved away from the dock, past the last markers of shore, and into open water. 7 days later, Nathan was found alive in a life raft roughly 100 nautical miles south of Martha's Vineyard. A passing Chinese cargo ship, the Orient Lucky, spotted the raft and alerted authorities. The U.S. Coast Guard coordinated the rescue. Nathan survived. Linda Carman did not return. Her body has never been recovered. This case is not simply about a boat that sank. It is about what happens when geography removes witnesses, when family wealth intersects with suspicion, and when the legal system never reaches a verdict. It is about the difference between allegation and proof, and how that difference can remain unresolved. Where the story truly begins is not in Rhode Island, but in Windsor, Connecticut. December 20th, 2013. John Chakalos, an 87-year-old real estate developer with a substantial property portfolio, was found shot to death inside his home. He had been shot multiple times with a Sig Sauer rifle. Nathan Carman owned a Sig Sauer rifle. At the time of Chakalos's death, no charges were filed. The homicide investigation remained open. Chakalos's estate was reported to be worth tens of millions of dollars. Following his death, probate disputes emerged among family members, including his daughters. One of those daughters was Linda Carman. Estate litigation, distribution concerns, and financial tension created a complicated family landscape. Wealth on that scale often carries layers of expectation, disagreement, and competing interests. When federal prosecutors indicted Nathan Carman in May 2022, they did not file a standalone murder charge for the death of John Chikalos. Instead, they described the 2013 killing as part of what they alleged was a broader scheme to defraud the estate. According to prosecutors, the homicide was a foundational act within a financial strategy. That distinction between a direct murder charge and an alleged act tied to fraud is legally significant. It reflects how the government framed the case. Investigators examined financial motive, but reporting also noted personal tensions within the family. Some accounts referenced Nathan's strong moral objections to aspects of his grandfather's personal life, specifically his relationship with a 25-year-old woman described as his mistress. Whether that objection was ideological, emotional, or exaggerated through hindsight remains debated. It does not establish motive, but it demonstrates that investigators were exploring more than money. They were examining ideology, resentment, perceived betrayal, and family strain. 3 years after Chikalos' death, mother and son departed Rhode Island on what appeared to be a routine fishing trip. Where oversight disappears is offshore. According to Nathan Carman's account, roughly 20 miles from land, the chickenpox began taking on water. He told investigators he attempted to determine the source of the flooding, but could not stop it. He deployed a life raft. He reported last seeing his mother seated toward the bow as the boat sank beneath the surface. The vessel was never recovered. Nathan stated he had been adrift for approximately 7 days. However, some experts and investigators questioned that timeline. Reports noted that, upon rescue, he did not appear as severely sunburned or dehydrated as might be expected after a full week exposed at sea. The observation did not prove wrongdoing. Physical responses vary, and survival equipment can mitigate exposure, but it introduced doubt. It became one of many details that investigators examined closely. Open water removed the primary physical crime scene. Without the boat and without Linda's body, reconstruction became interpretive. The ocean had erased direct evidence. Where theory replaces wreckage begins years later. May 10, 2022. A federal grand jury in Vermont indicted Nathan Carman. The charges included murder of Linda Carman within federal maritime jurisdiction, a firearms charge connected to the alleged broader estate fraud scheme, and insurance fraud related to the sinking of the vessel. Prosecutors alleged that Nathan had modified the chickenpox before the trip. According to the indictment, structural components were removed and drainage systems altered in ways that allegedly made the boat more vulnerable to sinking. The government's theory suggested premeditation rooted in financial gain. Though the boat was never recovered, the structural allegations were described in charging documents but were never tested in court. No jury heard expert testimony examining the hull. No cross-examination challenged the engineering claims in a completed trial. Nathan pleaded not guilty. The prosecution's theory relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, financial motive, and engineering assertions about a vessel resting somewhere beneath the Atlantic. The defense prepared to challenge those claims. A trial would have examined hull design, bilge systems, maritime survivability, inheritance sequencing, and forensic psychology. It would have tested competing narratives. How behavior shapes belief became another layer of the case. Throughout the investigation, observers commented on Nathan Carman's demeanor. Reports described him as calm, emotionally flat, and reserved during interviews. Supporters and defense experts argued that these interpretations failed to account for his diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, now classified under autism spectrum disorder. They contended that his affect, limited eye contact, monotone speech, focused and literal responses may have been misread as emotional detachment or calculation rather than neurological difference. Where the legal process stopped came before any of those questions could be resolved. On June 15, 2023, Nathan Carman was found dead in custody at the Cheshire County Jail in New Hampshire. Authorities ruled his death a suicide. The indictment had been filed in federal court in Vermont, but the prosecution ended in New Hampshire. With his death, the case stopped. No jury weighed the engineering allegations, no cross-examination tested the inheritance theory, no verdict was delivered. Linda Carman remains missing. John Chakalos's homicide remains without a conviction, and the central question, accident or intentional act, was never answered in court. The case 4. On April 6, 1997, Gregory Philip Malnery Jr. and Kimberly Ann Malnery drove to a sod farm in Charlotte County, Florida. It was a quiet stretch of rural land, defined by wide-open fields and irrigation ponds carved into the property. They had been invited to fish there on private land owned by James Dennis Ford. It was not an unusual invitation. Fishing on private property had happened before. There was no sign of alarm, no outward tension, no visible reason to decline. They brought their 22-month-old daughter, Miranda. The outing appeared ordinary. A family trip, a Sunday drive, a short escape to a rural landscape where the noise of town faded into open air. By the following morning, Gregory and Kimberly were dead. Their daughter would be found alive inside their pickup truck after spending the night alone on that same property. The court record establishes in stark and methodical detail what happened on that remote sod farm. It documents the sequence of injuries. It identifies the weapons. It describes the scene. It confirms the brutality. What it does not definitively establish is why. But one fact is clear. The location was used to lure them into isolation, and isolation changed everything. Greg and Kimberly accepted the fishing invitation without apparent alarm. Fishing at the sod farm was not unprecedented. There was no forced entry, no coercion, no evidence of struggle before arrival. They voluntarily entered property fully controlled by Ford. Once their truck crossed onto that land, they were within an environment chosen by someone else. Court records later emphasized that the remote sod farm was central to the crime. It provided seclusion and privacy. The ponds were surrounded by open fields with limited visibility from the surrounding roads. There were no nearby homes within immediate sight, no casual passers-by, no ambient witnesses. Departure marks the final moment of normalcy in the story. From documented evidence, there was no indication that Gregory or Kimberly anticipated danger when they arrived. The setting appeared calm, open sky, still water, the routine rhythm of a fishing day. But the choice of setting was deliberate. According to trial testimony and later appellate findings, the attack began with Gregory Malnery. He was shot in the head with a .22 caliber rifle, a disabling wound. That first shot altered the trajectory of the day instantly. Investigators concluded that after being shot, Gregory was bludgeoned with what court records describe as an axe-like blunt instrument. He was then dragged into a field where his throat was cut. Medical examiner testimony confirmed blunt force trauma consistent with a heavy-edged tool. The precise implement was described in court as an axe-like instrument rather than definitively identifying a specific axe. Kimberly was attacked separately near the pickup truck. Court findings confirm that she was sexually assaulted before being shot and killed. The separation of the attacks, Gregory in the field, Kimberly near the truck, reflects movement and time. It suggests progression rather than a single explosive moment. The use of multiple methods, firearm, blunt force trauma, and throat slashing reflects escalation. Each act intensified the violence. Each act required space and privacy. Amid this unfolding attack was Miranda. Investigators believe that during the initial chaos, likely after Gregory was shot, Kimberly managed to place her daughter inside the pickup truck and secure her in the car seat. This inference is based on scene reconstruction and the positioning of the child when discovered. It suggests a moment of protective action within overwhelming circumstances. Miranda was found secured inside the truck the next morning, alive, dehydrated, covered with insect bites, but alive. She had survived approximately 18 hours alone. The Florida Supreme Court opinion focuses primarily on the brutality of the crimes and the aggravating factors supporting the death sentence. It addresses the especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel nature of the murders. It details the calculated use of isolation, but it does not present a conclusive motive narrative that resolves the question of intent. What is documented remains stark. The victims were lured to a remote location. Gregory was shot first. He was bludgeoned with an axe-like blunt instrument and had his throat cut. Kimberly was sexually assaulted and shot near the truck. The child was left alive. Beyond these facts, the motive remains unclear in the official record. There were references during proceedings to prior familiarity and interactions between the parties, but no single confirmed motive fully accounts for the scale and brutality of the attack. When motive is unclear, analysis must remain restrained. Speculation cannot replace documentation. The record shows deliberate isolation. It does not fully reveal internal reasoning. On the morning of April 7, 1997, a farm worker made the initial discovery of the bodies on the sod farm property. That discovery triggered the official response. Authorities were contacted. Law enforcement arrived. The crime scene was secured. Gregory and Kimberly were confirmed deceased. Miranda was found inside the pickup truck after surviving the night alone. She required medical treatment for dehydration and insect bites, but recovered physically. James Dennis Ford was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, sexual battery with a firearm, and child abuse. In 1999, a jury convicted him. He was sentenced to death. The sentencing phase emphasized the especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel nature of the crimes, as well as the calculated use of isolation. Appeals followed for decades, moving through state and federal courts. On February 13, 2025, James Dennis Ford was executed by lethal injection. Irreversibility occurred in 1997. Legal finality came nearly 28 years later. If you want more true crime stories told with depth and honesty, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Your support helps us keep researching, producing, and bringing more cases that need to be heard. We move to Case 5. Nearly 28 years after a Montana teenager was found dead in shallow water along a quiet stretch of river, a DNA profile generated from 4 preserved rootless hairs identified a suspect. The announcement did not come with dramatic courtroom footage or a long-awaited arrest. It came through a press briefing and a summary of laboratory findings, the kind of update that sounds clinical, almost understated. But for a case that had lingered in uncertainty since 1996, it marked a profound shift. The name was Paul Nathaniel Hutchinson. He was 55 years old at the time he was identified. He lived in Dillon, Montana. In 1996, when the crime occurred, he had been a student at Montana State University. Over the decades that followed, he built what appeared to be an ordinary life. He worked for the Montana Bureau of Land Management. He was married. He had adult children. There was no public history linking him to violence, and authorities stated there was no known prior relationship between him and the victim, Danielle "Danny" Houchins. To understand why that classification lasted so long, we have to go back to September 21, 1996. On that day, 15-year-old Danielle "Danny" Houchins left her home in Belgrade, Montana, to go fly fishing along the Gallatin River. She was a teenager who loved the outdoors. Fishing in familiar places was not unusual for her, but that afternoon, she did not return. By evening, her family began searching. They located her truck at a fishing access site along the river. Not far from it, Danny was found face down in shallow water. The autopsy revealed evidence of sexual assault. Yet the official cause of death was listed as drowning. The manner of death was ruled undetermined. That ruling would shape the case for decades. Undetermined does not mean accidental. It means the medical examiner cannot definitively classify the manner of death as homicide, suicide, accident, or natural causes based on the available evidence. It is a category of uncertainty. In Danny's case, investigators later clarified that she had been suffocated in shallow water, not the victim of an accidental drowning. But without suspect identification or definitive forensic linkage at the time, the official classification remained unresolved. Among the evidence collected at the scene were 4 rootless hairs. In 1996, the science needed to extract meaningful DNA from such hairs had not yet matured. Laboratories could examine them microscopically, compare characteristics, and document them carefully, but they could not generate the kind of individualized genetic profile that modern investigations depend on. The hairs were preserved carefully. Investigators conducted interviews. They followed leads. They examined individuals who had been in the area. But without conclusive DNA evidence, no suspect was named. No arrest was made. The case entered what law enforcement calls a cold phase, not abandoned, but stalled. For Danny's family, the undetermined ruling became a painful point of contention. They believed the evidence indicated homicide, the presence of sexual assault, the circumstances under which she was found, and the details of the scene all pointed in one direction in their view. Yet, the official record did not reflect that certainty. Time passed. The Gallatin River continued to flow past the fishing access site. Seasons changed. People aged. The evidence remained in storage. In 2021 and 2022, the case was actively reopened. A new Gallatin County sheriff prioritized reviewing unsolved cases, including Danny's. Private investigator Tom Elfmont assisted in reassessing historical evidence and exploring whether modern forensic tools could now produce once impossible answers. The 4 preserved rootless hairs were resubmitted for advanced DNA testing. By the 2000s, forensic laboratories had developed techniques capable of extracting usable genetic information from rootless hairs using mitochondrial DNA sequencing and other highly sensitive methods. What had been scientifically inaccessible in 1996 was now feasible. From those hairs, a viable genetic profile was developed. Investigators then used forensic genetic genealogy, comparing the DNA profile to publicly accessible genealogy databases to identify potential familial matches. This method does not immediately identify a suspect. Instead, it narrows possibilities by locating relatives in genetic databases and building family trees that can lead to a single individual. Through that process, investigators narrowed the field to Paul Nathaniel Hutchinson. In July 2024, Hutchinson agreed to a voluntary 2-hour interview with investigators. According to authorities, he initially appeared composed, but when confronted with the DNA findings, his behavior changed significantly. Officers noted extreme nervousness. He began sweating profusely. At one point, he reportedly chewed on his hand. Investigators later described this shift as a marked departure from his earlier demeanor. Hours after the interview concluded, Hutchinson died by suicide. He was never formally charged. There was no trial. There was no jury verdict. Case 6. On July 20, 1996, along the south coast of Devon, England, a small yacht named Lady Jane left its mooring near Woodbury. The tide was steady. The weather gave no reason for concern. 2 men were aboard, Ronald Joseph Platt, Albert Johnson Walker. Only one of them would return. The sea that afternoon was calm. The harbor was undisturbed. Boats moved in and out in ordinary patterns. There were no storm warnings, no signs of mechanical failure, no evidence of conflict visible from shore. Nothing about the environment suggested rupture. No one watching from land would have sensed that the quiet outing was anything other than recreational. But the danger was never environmental. It was structural. Because Albert Johnson Walker had already erased one life before he set foot on that boat. In the 1980s, Albert Johnson Walker built a respected financial advisory practice in Ontario, Canada. Clients entrusted him with savings, inheritances, and retirement plans accumulated over decades. He cultivated trust through professionalism and familiarity. He positioned himself as dependable, informed, and stable. To the outside world, he represented financial security. Behind that professional image, he was siphoning millions of dollars from clients and relatives. Funds meant for long-term safety were redirected. Accounts were manipulated. Paper trails were obscured. For years, the deception held. By 1990, financial discrepancies surfaced. Investors demanded answers. Questions multiplied. Pressure mounted. Legal exposure became imminent. Walker did not stay to confront it. In 1990, he abandoned his home in Paris, Ontario, and fled to Britain. He left behind fraud investigations, shattered savings, and families facing financial devastation. His departure was not impulsive, it was strategic. When one identity became unstable, he did not attempt repair, he replaced it. In the United Kingdom, Walker rebuilt under assumed names, including David Davis. He re-established himself socially and financially. He purchased property. He embedded himself in community life. He projected credibility once again. To new acquaintances, he appeared established and reliable. The past did not follow him openly, but the reinvention extended beyond paperwork and bank accounts. Walker lived with his biological daughter, Sheena. To neighbors and acquaintances, he presented her as his wife. They had 2 children together. During the later murder trial, the paternity of those children became a subject of intense public scrutiny and media speculation. The revelation unsettled observers not merely because of its impropriety, but because it revealed a pattern of distortion so deep that it extended into the most intimate aspects of life. It reflects a pattern, identity reconstruction across financial and personal domains. Walker was not merely evading prosecution, he was rewriting reality. Roles were reassigned, relationships were reframed, boundaries were redrawn. The narrative he constructed placed him at the center of a life built on deliberate misrepresentation, and central to that rewrite was the identity of Ronald Joseph Platt. Platt had once been a client in Canada. Years earlier, he had mentioned plans to relocate to England. Walker remembered. In Britain, Walker began using Platt's identity in financial transactions. Accounts were opened, documents secured, deals conducted under Platt's name. It was a calculated appropriation of a real person's existence. For a period, the deception held. Then the real Ronald Joseph Platt moved to England. 2 men occupying the same identity space. The structure Walker built began to destabilize. A stolen name can function only if the original owner remains distant or silent. Once proximity enters the equation, the architecture weakens. Exposure becomes possible. The carefully layered narrative begins to crack. On July 20th, 1996, the Lady Jane departed from its mooring near Woodbury, Devon. Witnesses later confirmed that both Walker and Platt were aboard. The vessel moved into open water under clear skies. Walker returned alone. He claimed Platt had fallen overboard, a tragic accident at sea. The explanation relied entirely on environmental plausibility. Fishing boats shift, balance falters, water swallows quickly. A momentary slip can become irreversible. In that setting, loss can appear sudden and unpreventable. The Devon coast that afternoon was calm. But 5 days later, a body surfaced off the coast of Brixham. It was weighted with an anchor. The rope securing the anchor was tied deliberately. The autopsy concluded drowning as the cause of death. But investigators documented something critical, an injury to the back of Platt's head. The wound indicated blunt force trauma consistent with being struck before entering the water. That detail fractured the narrative of accident. Accidental falls do not typically involve head injury, followed by deliberate anchor weighting. The sea had been used to simulate tragedy. Identification proved difficult due to saltwater exposure and decomposition. Facial recognition was compromised. Standard visual confirmation was uncertain. Then, investigators examined what remained intact. A Rolex watch. The serial number was traced through service records. That record led directly to Ronald Joseph Platt. In a case defined by stolen identity, it was a precision instrument that restored the victim's name. The very object designed to measure time became the mechanism through which truth re-emerged. Walker had attempted erasure. Documentation reversed it. Financial investigation deepened motive. Walker had been using Platt's identity in transactions and accounts. The real Platt's presence in England threatened exposure. His continued existence represented instability in Walker's constructed life. The fishing trip was not leisure, it was elimination. Walker was arrested in 1997 as investigative findings converged. Financial records, witness statements, and forensic evidence aligned. The calm narrative dissolved under scrutiny. In 1998, he stood trial at Exeter Crown Court. He pleaded not guilty. The prosecution relied on structure rather than confession. Witnesses placed both men aboard the Lady Jane. The anchor and rope evidence, the head injury, financial records showing identity exploitation, Rolex serial tracing, the revelation of his domestic arrangement, presenting his biological daughter as his wife and fathering 2 children with her, intensified public perception of sustained deception. It reinforced a portrait of a man willing to distort fundamental boundaries to preserve a constructed life. This was not sudden rage. It was a calculated escalation. Walker was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. We now advance to Case 7. The Supreme Court of Western Australia determined that Sammy Jonathan Hietinen killed Lindsay Edward Judas to steal his vehicle and camping equipment. Justice Ralph Simmons concluded that Hietinen had formed an intent to kill to facilitate the theft. This was not an argument that escalated unexpectedly. It was not confusion or panic. It was a deliberate act for material gain. In February 2013, 55-year-old Lindsay Judas traveled from Queensland to Broome, Western Australia for a fishing holiday. He carried high-value camping gear. He drove a Nissan Navara utility. Someone else saw an opportunity, and by the end of that trip, Judas would be buried in a shallow grave in bushland near Crab Creek Road. Lindsay Judas was a bus driver, employed, reliable, structured in routine. He traveled to Broome for fishing, a quiet break. Remote Western Australia is known for its coastline, open terrain, and isolation. Campsites stretch across red dirt tracks with minimal oversight. Isolation creates stillness. It also creates vulnerability. Near Crab Creek Road, Judas encountered another camper, Sammy Jonathan Hietinen, then 39 years old. The court later established that Hietinen formed an intention to steal Judas's property, specifically his vehicle and valuable equipment. During the March 2016 trial in the Supreme Court of Western Australia, prosecutors presented evidence that Hietinen struck Lindsay Judas on the head with a metal bar. The injuries were catastrophic. Skull fractures consistent with repeated force. Justice Ralph Simmons described the killing as brutal and senseless, carried out for material gain. The court accepted that Hietinen intended to kill to facilitate robbery. Intent is critical. It means the decision preceded the blow. This was not a struggle spiraling out of control. It was violence deployed to remove an obstacle between the offender and the property he wanted. After killing Judas, Hietinen buried him in a shallow grave in bushland near the campsite. Burial indicates awareness of consequence, awareness of wrongdoing. The body was concealed. Then Hietinen drove away in Judas's Nissan Navara. The theft was complete, but concealment continued. His then partner, Stacey Mary Knight, later admitted assisting after the fact. She pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact, having helped with disposal efforts involving Judas's vehicle. The killing was calculated. The concealment was sustained. When Lindsay Judas did not return to Queensland, concern escalated. A missing person investigation began. Time stretched. For nearly 2 years, his body remained buried near Broome. In November 2014, police located skeletal remains in bushland near Crab Creek Road. Dental records confirmed they were Lindsay Judas. Remote geography delayed discovery. It did not erase evidence. Charges were laid against Hietinen. The matter proceeded to trial. In March 2016, a jury found him guilty of murder. The verdict affirmed the prosecution's argument. The killing was committed to facilitate theft. Justice Ralph Simmons sentenced Sammy Jonathan Hietinen to life imprisonment. The minimum non-parole period, 24 years. He cannot apply for parole until 2038. The judge emphasized the brutality of the crime and its motive, material gain. There was no mitigating narrative of provocation or fear. Stacy Mary Knight received a custodial sentence for her role as an accessory after the fact. The legal response was permanent. When homicide is used to achieve robbery, the penalty reflects that permanence. Case 8. Daniel James Nolan was 14 years old when he disappeared on the night of 1st January 2002 in Hamble-le-Rice, Hampshire, England. He was a teenager at the beginning of a new year, living in a quiet riverside community where fishing along the River Hamble was a normal, almost routine activity. There was nothing outwardly unusual about that evening. It was New Year's Day, a time when many families were still recovering from celebrations, when life felt slow and ordinary. Daniel had gone fishing with friends along the River Hamble, a tidal stretch of water better known for moored boats and leisure sailing than for danger. The river winds through Hampshire toward the Solent, shaped by tides that rise and fall twice daily. For local teenagers, the pontoons and riverbanks were familiar ground. It was not an isolated wilderness. It was a known place. Before leaving, Daniel told his parents he would be home by around 2 a.m. That detail would later carry weight. It marked the final expectation, the final normal promise of return. He left like any other teenager, stepping out for a few hours with friends. No signs of distress, no warning. He never returned. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic accident waiting to be explained. A teenage boy near dark water. Winter temperatures hovering low. A riverbank at night where footing could be uncertain. The simplest explanation appeared to be an accidental fall into cold water. But as hours became days and days became months, the silence deepened. What happened between the last confirmed sighting and the moment he vanished? Why did no one immediately detect distress? And why, despite search efforts, did clarity never arrive? On the evening of the 1st of January 2002, Daniel met a group of friends near a pontoon along the River Hamble. It was a familiar local gathering point. Young people fished there often. There was no indication that the meeting itself was unusual. Sometime close to midnight, Daniel reportedly separated from the group. Accounts indicate he walked away to retrieve fishing equipment. The act itself was ordinary, stepping away briefly to collect gear. He did not come back. When 2 a.m. passed and Daniel had not returned home, his parents raised the alarm. Hampshire police began immediate search efforts. The response was swift and serious. Helicopters were deployed to scan the river and the surrounding terrain from above. Police divers entered the water. Search teams combed the shoreline and nearby woodland areas. The River Hamble is tidal, which complicates recovery operations. Objects entering the water can be carried downstream by outgoing tides and drawn back in with incoming ones. Winter conditions add further difficulty, both in search visibility and in survival timelines. Despite intensive efforts, no trace of Daniel was found in the immediate area. No clothing was recovered. No fishing equipment surfaced. No clear signs of disturbance were identified at the pontoon. In the early stages, investigators did not publicly confirm foul play. The working possibilities included accidental drowning, given the setting and conditions. For many families in coastal regions, tragic accidents involving water are sadly familiar. But two elements complicated that assumption. First, no immediate physical evidence surfaced to confirm a fall. There were no confirmed splash witnesses. No clear sign that Daniel had slipped or struggled. Second, Daniel had not been alone. When someone vanishes alone, investigators focus on reconstructing that person's path, movements, terrain, and environmental hazards. When someone vanishes from within a group, investigators must also reconstruct interactions. More than a year later, on 15 May 2003, human remains were discovered at Chapman's Pool near Swanage in Dorset, roughly 30 miles from Hamble-le-Rice by coastal distance. The remains consisted of feet still inside socks. DNA testing later confirmed that the remains belonged to Daniel Nolan. The discovery confirmed death. It did not provide a definitive explanation. In tidal estuary systems, Bodies can be transported by complex current patterns into open water and then along coastlines. Marine decomposition often results in disarticulation, meaning certain body parts separate naturally over time due to environmental and biological processes. Forensic oceanography can often model how remains may travel. It can explain movement. It cannot always explain origin. The official cause of death was not publicly determined as homicide, nor was it conclusively ruled an accident. The circumstances remained unresolved. In 2009, after years without definitive resolution, Daniel Nolan was formally declared dead. The legal declaration acknowledged what evidence had already established. He would not be coming home. Case 9. On June 1, 2013, in Pubnico Harbor, Nova Scotia, 28-year-old Philip Boudreau was shot. His boat was struck and overturned, and he vanished into the Atlantic. His body has never been recovered. Philip Boudreau grew up in Lower East Pubnico, in a community where lobster fishing defines both livelihood and identity. The dispute that led to his death did not appear overnight. There had been years of tension between Boudreau and other local fishermen, particularly surrounding allegations of gear interference. In a small coastal village, those accusations carried weight. Fishing territories are tied to income, survival, and family tradition. Friction lingered. Words had already been exchanged in the past. On the morning of June 1st, Dwayne Sampson was aboard his lobster vessel with his son, James Joseph Landry, most often referred to in court records as James Landry and Craig Landry. Evidence presented at trial established that Boudreau was operating his speedboat near lobster traps associated with Sampson's operation. What followed was not a rumor. It was reconstructed through testimony, forensic review, and statements introduced before a jury. James Landry fired 4 shots from a rifle toward Boudreau's speedboat. One bullet struck Boudreau in the leg. The shooting was not denied. It was a central fact in the case. After the shots were fired, the larger lobster vessel collided with Boudreau's smaller craft. The impact caused Boudreau's boat to capsize. Trial evidence established that Boudreau did not immediately disappear beneath the water. Witness testimony described him clinging to a floating red gas can after the vessel overturned. He was injured but alive, holding on to something buoyant in open ocean. The Crown argued that what happened next turned a confrontation into homicide. Prosecutors presented evidence that while Boudreau clung to the gas can, attempts were made to hook him with a gaff from the lobster vessel. A gaff is a long pole with a metal hook at the end, typically used to secure fish or gear. According to the Crown's reconstruction, Boudreau was hooked while in the water and dragged alongside the vessel. The prosecution further alleged that after he was dragged, his body was tied to an anchor and dropped overboard to prevent it from resurfacing. That allegation formed a critical part of the case. It suggested not only lethal violence, but an effort to conceal the outcome permanently. The defense challenged key parts of that narrative. Lawyers argued that hauling or dragging an adult man from the water using a gaff from the deck of a lobster boat in open sea would have been extremely difficult. They questioned whether the mechanics described by the Crown were realistic under those conditions. They emphasized the absence of a body. They argued that without physical remains, the jury had to be cautious in accepting every element of the prosecution's reconstruction. Philip Boudreau's body has never been found. Canadian criminal law does not require a body to secure a conviction. Jurors were instructed that death can be proven through circumstantial evidence and credible testimony if the chain of events establishes guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The case rested on what witnesses saw, what was said afterward, and what the physical evidence suggested about the encounter at sea. One of the most significant pieces of evidence came from statements James Landry made during police interrogation. According to trial testimony, he admitted that he intended to destroy Boudreau during the confrontation. He also described his state of mind at the time as seeing black. Those statements were introduced in court. They indicated intense anger. They reflected an emotional breaking point after years of conflict. But anger alone does not determine a legal category of homicide. The jury had to decide whether the Crown had proven second-degree murder or manslaughter. Under Canadian law, second-degree murder requires proof beyond reasonable doubt that the accused intended to kill or intended to cause bodily harm that he knew was likely to result in death. Manslaughter requires proof that an unlawful act caused death, even if specific intent to kill is not established. The prosecution argued that firing multiple rifle shots at a man at sea, striking him, colliding with his vessel, and engaging in aggressive conduct while he was in the water demonstrated the required intent for murder. The defense argued that while the acts were unlawful and dangerous, the Crown had not met the high burden necessary to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Landry intended to kill. The jury did not convict James Joseph Landry of second-degree murder. He was found guilty of manslaughter. In 2017, he received a 14-year prison sentence, later adjusted for credit for time served in custody before sentencing. Dwayne Sampson pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Craig Landry initially faced murder charges as well. As proceedings progressed, those charges were reduced. He ultimately testified for the Crown. Reports at different procedural stages describe a significantly lesser outcome for him, commonly cited as approximately 2 years imprisonment or a probationary sentence connected to his cooperation. The legal outcomes reflected the jury's conclusion that unlawful and dangerous actions caused Philip Boudreau's death, but that the Crown had not proven the specific intent required for murder beyond a reasonable doubt. We have now arrived at Case 10. The alleged motive did not begin on the riverbank. It began earlier in private conversations, in suspicions that may or may not have been fully confirmed, and in the emotional aftermath of what prosecutors later described as betrayal. At trial, the Crown told a story of resentment rooted in humiliation. They argued that Muhammad Khan believed his wife had been involved in an affair with Shah Alam, the brother of Shahid Alam. The alleged relationship was not between Khan's wife and Shahid himself, but prosecutors contended that anger does not always move in straight lines. According to the Crown's case, the perceived betrayal did not remain confined to the two people allegedly involved. Instead, it spread outward, directed toward the Alam family more broadly. In their narrative, humiliation became grievance, and grievance became motive. On April 5, 2016, in Rockhampton, Queensland, Khan collected 33-year-old Syed Alam for what was described as a fishing trip along the Fitzroy River. There was nothing outwardly unusual about the plan. Fishing trips are common in the region. The Fitzroy River is a familiar landmark woven into local life. Two men getting into a vehicle with rods and equipment would not have drawn attention. Alam disappeared that night. When he did not return home, concern escalated quickly. Family members attempted contact. Calls went unanswered. As hours stretched into a full day, then what had been a routine absence shifted into alarm. A missing person report was filed. Police began tracing the last known movements. 11 days later, on April 16, 2016, Alam's body was found near the river. The discovery transformed uncertainty into tragedy. What had begun as a search became a homicide investigation. The Fitzroy River, once simply a location on a map, became central to a criminal inquiry. The act began with two men and a boat, but the consequences radiated outward, into families, into courtrooms, and into a community forced to confront uncertainty about what had happened and what had truly been proven. The smallest circle in this story is the boat. On the evening of April 5, 2016, Khan and Alam traveled together toward the Fitzroy River. Mobile phone data, later presented in court, showed both men were in the same general location that evening. That detail became significant at trial. In cases without direct witnesses, digital traces often become silent narrators. Towers ping, locations narrow, timelines are built minute by minute. Syed Alam was last seen alive that night. When he failed to return home, his family reported him missing. Search efforts began along the river and surrounding bushland. Officers canvassed areas near the water. Volunteers assisted. Days passed with no answers. For 11 days, uncertainty hung over Rockhampton. On April 16, 2016, Allam's body was discovered near the Fitzroy River in Rockhampton. The discovery confirmed that what had started as a missing person case was now a homicide investigation. The location reinforced the timeline. The fishing trip was not incidental, it was central. The prosecution's case in 2020 relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. Khan was the last known person with Alam. Phone records placed them together near the river. The Crown argued motive stemming from the alleged affair involving Khan's wife and Shah Alam. There were no eyewitnesses to the killing itself. No video recording. No direct admission by the accused. No confession was introduced before the jury. The case was constructed on inference, a chain of circumstances the jury would later be asked to evaluate carefully. Each link in that chain had to support the next. If one weakened, the entire structure risked collapse. When does last seen with become legally sufficient proof? That question would define everything that followed. Nearly 4 years passed before the trial concluded in early 2020. During proceedings in the Queensland Supreme Court, the Crown presented its narrative. Resentment over marital betrayal had escalated into lethal violence. Although the alleged affair involved Khan's wife and Shah Alam, not Syed himself, prosecutors suggested that anger was redirected towards Syed Alam. In their view, grievance did not need to follow a direct line. It only needed to find a target. The prosecution emphasized the timeline of April 5, 2016. Mobile phone location evidence placing both men near the river. Behavioral inconsistencies in statements given during the investigation. The defense, in turn, focused on the limits of inference. Suspicion, they argued, is not proof. Being the last person seen with someone does not automatically establish guilt. Circumstantial cases can be powerful, but only if they exclude every reasonable alternative explanation. In February 2020, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Mohammed Khan was sentenced to life imprisonment. For the victim's family, the conviction represented acknowledgement of wrongdoing and legal accountability. For the accused and his family, it marked the beginning of imprisonment and the weight of a life sentence. But the legal process did not end there. Khan appealed the conviction to the Queensland Court of Appeal, arguing that the evidence presented at trial did not exclude reasonable doubt. His defense contended that although the circumstantial evidence raised suspicion, it did not conclusively prove guilt beyond the high threshold required in a murder case. In November 2020, the appellate court agreed. The judges determined that the evidence, while capable of supporting suspicion, did not eliminate reasonable doubt in a way that met the criminal standard of proof. The conviction was quashed, and an acquittal was entered. Thank you for watching. Please like the video and subscribe to help us continue bringing important cases into public knowledge.